Okay, very good. And thank you, Amy. And welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. Good morning for those of you who are farther west than some of us. Very glad that you were able to join us today. We had hoped originally that we would have some very significant news to share with you regarding legislation emerging from Congress with regard to the COVID-19 situation. As it turns out, we do not have significant progress from Congress, but do not give up, or for that matter, do not feel you can walk away. There are reasons to think that we may still be seeing additional legislation. We do have some matters that have come from the president with regard to specific memorandums and specific requests to the bureaucracy. And it's not too early to be thinking about what we could be looking for as far as tax legislation going into the future year after the election. So with that, let's begin the, let me turn the, I apologize. Let's begin now with the, what do we do now that Congress has gone home? And in fact, Congress has gone home. The House is coming back for a short period of time to address the current postal service issue. I don't think that is likely to go too much farther than action in the House of Representatives. I think that would be a very difficult vote for Majority Leader McConnell to ask his members to take. And it would not surprise me if that is something that lays low for a little while, at least over on the Senate side. So Congress was unable to come to an agreement, and Congress has indeed gone home. Now, that is subject to the calls of the chair, and they could be told to be back shortly. At this stage, it would be a surprise, I think, if we saw them back before the end of the August recess, which is scheduled to end the day after Labor Day. So let's leaving Congress on their way home to their districts. Let's move on and talk for a few minutes at least about what we do have, which is what the president announced a week ago. And here, I think there is some point in taking a look at some of the details. The provisions that the president signed, it seems, and from talking with people who work with people in the White House, they were very careful to try and design programs which would withstand judicial challenge. There was a great deal of concern that the Democrats would challenge these as beyond presidential authority, and that the courts might agree. So as a consequence, I think you see a lot of factors built into the 4 announcements that the president made, which are intended to lock it into authority that clearly he has. And at this point, it will be a surprise, I think, to many if any of these were to be successfully challenged. Let's start with the supplemental unemployment benefits, which of course has been one of the great controversies with respect to how that is to be handled, and one of the reasons that Congress left without coming to any conclusions. Essentially, the proposal from or the memorandum from the president provided for an additional $300 per week supplemental unemployment benefit on the expectation that an additional $100 would be provided by the individual states, which gets us to the $400 amount that was used during his presentation. Now, since then, the question, of course, immediately came up, do the states really have to come up with that $100? And a number of states, both Democratic and Republican-led, moved very forcefully to declare that their budgets could not provide for that additional $100. Now, we don't have any formal statements. We don't have anything official yet. But the unofficial statements from senior administration officials is that no, the states are not going to have to come up with their share in order for their citizens to access the $300 per week from the from the feds. So $300, $400, a lot's going to depend. The suggestion in the memorandum was, well, the states haven't spent all the money that they got in CARES. This is a good way for them to spend it. Some questions as to whether the math really worked on that, and certainly a number of states, and I say again from both Democratic and Republican sides, made it very clear that they had some other plans for the remainder of the CARES money, and that the $100 a week was not something they were in a position to come up with. Where are the federals going to get their money? Well, the memorandum directs it to be distributed from the Department of Homeland Security's Disaster Relief Fund. And at the time that the president's memo was signed, the balance of that fund was about $69 billion. And the memorandum directs $44 billion of that to be directed to these payments. DHS has announced that they are prepared to make payments for the first 3 weeks out of that amount. Now, the memorandum, the additional money, terminates by the terms of the memo either on December the 6th or when the balance of the disaster relief fund is reduced to $25 billion. The 3 weeks is not a final number, but some outside groups have estimated the amount that would be needed to come from the disaster relief fund, and it looks more like 5 weeks worth of benefits have been provided here. If that, which good takes us into the middle of September, when hopefully Congress will be back, and this is something that can be approached then. One item of note, South Dakota has already declined taking the money. The governor there stated that the unemployment situation was not so grave as to require this additional money. That is the only state so far that has taken that position. So that's where we are with respect to the supplemental unemployment from the president. The item that probably has gotten the most attention is certainly going to require the most active participation on the part of the tax community is the proposal for payroll tax deferral. I should not say proposal. It is an order for payroll tax deferral. And you see here on the screen the language that defers deposit, payment, and so much of the tax, in fact, on wages or compensation that is paid during the period from September 1. It's not effective yet. We've got a few weeks yet to figure out how this is all going to work through the end of the year. Now, this is not a deferral for everyone. It's available with respect to any employee who is essentially earning less than $4,000 per biweekly pay period. And here the problems begin. Okay, what is generally less than $4,000 per biweekly pay period? And for that matter, who's an employee? By its terms, this provision applies only to the employee's share of the OASDI, the Social Security part of employment taxes. They are not touching the Medicare tax. The Medicare tax still has to be collected and paid on both the employer and the employee side. The OASDI portion on the employer side was already deferred in the CARES Act, 50% payable at the end of 2021 and 50% payable at the end of 2022. So we're not dealing with that. The only piece that is really in play here is the employee's share of Social Security taxes. The memorandum by its terms is limited to employees. There is some question as to whether self-employed were intended to be covered, but by the terms of the memorandum, they are not. It is limited to employees, and the code sections that are referenced are those that deal with employees and not with the self-employment tax itself. Keep in mind, taxes are deferred. They are not being eliminated. They are not being forgiven. Ultimately, the expectation is that these taxes will be paid. Now, the president, as part of his speech during the signing ceremony, said it would certainly be his intention, if reelected, to forgive these taxes. Now, it's not clear whether he meant taxes that are not being collected through the end of 2020 or whether that somehow carries forward into the future. Staff in the White House seem to have been walking back any idea that that is to extend into the future, and really would focus you only on potential forgiveness for the period. But that is not something that the White House has concluded they can do on their own. They will need legislative support for doing that. And that is why we feel that the president has said that that is something that he looks to do once he is reelected, not necessarily something that he is trying to promise today. Do keep in mind, it really is, this is an interest-free deferral. We're not going to be charging interest. We're not going to be charging any penalties. Nothing is going to be charged so long as these amounts are paid when they are ultimately due. Does the memorandum say when they are ultimately due? No, it does not. Is it the first pay period in 2021? Is there perhaps going to be a spread over 2021? That is something that we're going to have to wait for additional guidance with respect to. Now, that's obviously not the only question people have with respect to how are we going to handle this payroll tax deferral. The biggest one probably is, geez, do we have to it? And again, some sources from the White House have suggested, well, no, maybe the employer does not have to defer withholding. And the reason that you might choose to do that is, geez, what happens if this guy's no longer employed after 2020? Who is going to pay the deferred taxes? Who is going to collect the deferred taxes? Who is going to remit the deferred taxes? And I, as the employer, sure hope it's not me. But again, this is the kind of thing that we're still looking for guidance with respect to. We are hoping we will see before the September 1 effective date. I know that everyone would like to go ahead and do whatever programming they need to do, particularly if they wanted to take the last 2 weeks of August off. That does not seem to be in the cards. Beyond the question of do we have to do it, do we as employers have to do it, but also how do you define this $4,000 per biweekly pay period? If we just take an annual income test, take 4,000, multiply it by 26, we get 104 grand. If that's sufficient, okay. So I don't make more than $4,000 in the biweekly period, I'm okay. But does that mean any biweekly period? So what if I get bonuses that would substantially increase the pay above $4,000 in the biweekly period, but my regular biweekly payment is less than $4,000? What do I do about overtime? What do I do about companies that are part-time? What if he takes it? What if he takes leave? All of these are open questions. Even what is included in compensation. So far in the COVID-19 legislation, we've typically seen included in the concept of compensation the employer's share of medical insurance premiums, contributions into 401k plans. All of these, again, are definitions that we are awaiting guidance on. And as I say, hopefully we will see these before anybody has to do anything with respect to the first pay period beginning after, or actually the first pay period, it would seem, including September 1 of 2020. All right. Those have been the two announcements from the president that have received obviously the most attention. There are two others. One with respect to federal student loans. and their payments have essentially been deferred until 2021. Interest is not running with respect to those deferred payments. Now, keep in mind, this is for federal student loans and not for private student loans. Essentially, the same group of loans that was impacted in the CARES Act is being impacted here again. The expectation here is, again, I say that this is how it will be interpreted, because it's not that the president, announced a new law. What he did was he directed the Secretary of Education to behave in a certain way so that federal student loan payments were not being collected during the rest of this year. The fourth item, and of somewhat broader application, is the assistance to renters and homeowners. The provision in the CARES Act that prohibited, essentially effectively prohibited eviction, was scheduled and is scheduled to run out of pretty close to the end of August. This is the attempt to weave through, to take the camel through the needle's eye of keeping this from legal challenge, and yet at the same time attempting to do something positive with respect. And so what has been done here is the secretaries of Housing and Urban Development, the secretaries of Health and Human Services, the Secretary of the Treasury have been told to get together and, one, consider whether keeping it temporarily halting evictions is important to prevent the spread of COVID-19, identify federal funds that can be made available for temporary assistance. Remember, we just took $44 billion out of the emergency funds in order to provide the additional $300 per week on the supplemental unemployment, and then also to identify actions consistent with applicable law to promote the ability of renters and homeowners to avoid eviction or foreclosure, as well as to review the existing authorities and resources, which I guess means that they didn't quite finish the process of figuring out what they still could do before the president needed to go ahead and make his presentation at the golf club. So that is the summary of where we are. That brings us to our first polling question, which, again, we remind you, if you like CPE, there is a open here. Please answer. Are the federal student loan payments deferred until 2021? True or false?
All right, you should see that polling question on your screen. You should be able to click on it and provide your answer. If you're not able to click on it, or if you're not able to see it, chances are you joined through a web browser instead of the Zoom app and aren't able to answer. So just let me know if you have any troubles. There's quite a few of you on today, so we'll leave this open for about 15 more seconds if you'd like to answer. As a reminder, Zoom polling questions are for CPE credit, so in order to get credit, we do need you to answer.
While we're waiting for the answers, Amy, I might say, I think what we're going to try and do today is take questions at the very end of the presentation. And obviously, if you, so there is down at the bottom of your screen a Q&A button. Please feel free to submit any questions you have. If you don't feel comfortable doing that, or if you do not, you think of a question after we've completed, after we've finished, please feel free to email those to me. You can get my email address, which is mschwartz, there's no T in Schwartz, mschwartz@eidbailey.com, and I will try and get the responses to you as we can. So are we ready to move ahead, Amy?
You are ready to move ahead. Go ahead.
All right, let's see here. So
you had 96% say true.
Well, good. I'm delighted that people here either have been reading the newspaper or actually are listening, and both of those, I'm gratified, whichever of the reasons they are. All right. The president has done what the president feels he can do without facing successful challenge in the courts anyway. Uh, is there still legislation to come in 2020, or are we just done? I think there are very good reasons to think that we are still going to have some legislation. The economy is not doing, I mean, it's doing better, but it is not clicking along on all cylinders. Let's just take a look at a couple of slides here. We take a look at the, this is a long-term projection that the Congressional Budget Office does periodically, about twice, sometimes 3 times a year, on what our gross domestic product, change in gross domestic product is likely to be for that year. And essentially what you're seeing here is an enormous valley for 2020 and 2021 of a quarterly loss in the numbers of, hundreds of billions of dollars via what we would normally expect gross domestic product to be. At the same time, again, the numbers have come down a little, but we still have seen a significant spike in the unemployment rate. Both of these items are ones that many people feel call for current government help. And that current government help at this stage, it looks like the president has done what he can do immediately, is going to have to come from Congress coming back and getting together, as we say. And, plus, every member of the House of Representatives is running for re-election in November. A little over 1/3 of the Senate is running for re-election in November. They like to be able to tell their constituents that, yes, indeed, we accomplished something. When help was needed, we provided some help. Maybe there is a restraint on how much of that help is appropriate in the minds of some, but doing nothing has never been the most positive of political messages the closer that we get to an election. Also, keep in mind, spending authority for the federal government is approved on a fiscal year by fiscal year basis, and the government's fiscal year ends September 30, 2020. So Congress is going to have to do something, or the government's going to shut down. And I believe that the general consensus is 1 month from the election, that is probably not something that the members of Congress wish to have happen. All those are good reasons I think we could still have legislation. Now, there are also reasons we may not have legislation. The sides have already walked away. We have this, we have a different situation this year, in that we don't need a compromise just between the Democrats and the Republicans. We need a compromise between Democrats, Republicans, and the White House. And each of those 3 sides has a somewhat different view of how we should or should not go forward with additional COVID-19 legislation. Also, although it's nice to point out that spending the government could shut down September 30, continuing resolutions have consistently been used to avoid the September 30 shutdown date, and there's absolutely no reason it could not be used. In my mind, and this is strictly my opinion, I think the reasons that we could still have legislation outweigh those as to why we will not have legislation. But this is by no means a 100% guarantee, and is something I think that we're simply going to have to keep alert and keep aware of. As we mentioned at the beginning when we discussed what's now, since Congress has gone home, you're going to see various proposals begin to be floated. I think there is a Republican proposal that was leaked. I believe it was either late yesterday or early this morning that Politico picked up. It's a small package that essentially would focus on a $300 per permanent, or for the rest of the year, a $300 supplemental unemployment payment. That is more of, it appears, of a working idea. Maybe a initial offer, an indication of here's where this issue is, at least for that group of Republicans right now. But then again, we don't know. But then again, we don't know exactly where all of that will go. If we do have or certainly even if we talk about legislation, then, well, okay, and here I guess we should have shown this one as well. This is one of the reasons that at least some members, particularly of the Senate, Republican members of the Senate, think, maybe we've done enough. We do have, we've put a significant amount of additional deficit out on the table. You see the light line is where we assumed the deficit would be, current deficit would be a year ago. And then the dark line is the actual deficit that we got. Now, again, we only have the final numbers through May, but you can see we've already built up a pretty significant increase on a month-to-month basis of what versus what we were originally expecting. Okay. What are the items that are going to have to be resolved if we're going to have legislation? Well, the first one obviously is the size. The Democratic legislation, the HEROES Act that they passed over a month ago, rang in at around $3 trillion. The combination approval between the administration and the Senate Republican leadership, the so-called HEALS Act, came in right at $1 trillion. And that's a pretty big gap. Now, the Democrats have said that they are willing to go down to 2. The various members of the administration have said they are willing to go up a little bit from the $1 trillion, but so far that the two movements have not reached a common point in the middle. And here is where some of the three-party issue comes into play, because there are probably 10 to 15 Republican senators who are opposed to legislation at the $1 trillion price tag, much less what may happen if indeed what we see is, let's say, splitting it down the middle and we go to $1.5 trillion. The main point of contention, one other than the size, has been the insistence from the Democratic side that some additional direct aid be provided to the states and localities. They included $687 billion of this in their legislation. The Senate Republican leadership has insisted on some level of liability protection as businesses try and reopen. And it's a pretty broad liability protection that has been proposed. Could be held liable in a COVID-19 related action only if they failed to make reasonable efforts to follow applicable public health guidelines. No indication as to who is responsible for that, but we can get to that later. And committed either an act of gross negligence or intentional misconduct. So simple failure to follow the applicable public health guidelines would not be sufficient to make a cause of action recoverable. It would, you would also have to have proof of gross negligence or intentional misconduct, which is a very, very high standard. We have been told that if the Democrats are probably interested in a compromise here, particularly with regard to liability protection. There is an understanding that some protection probably is appropriate as we try and restart the economy. That is likely to be, though I think they will insist on some toning down of the gross negligence or intentional misconduct language, and probably some directive that they feel will make applicable public health guidelines subject to something other than directive by the president. How they will want to write that is still to be seen. how far the Republicans are willing to go with regard to direct aids to states and localities, particularly with regard to how far the administration is willing to go. Again, there may be a number there, but it's likely to be significantly lower than $687 billion. Is there a trade between these two proposals that could be made? Certainly. It is a trade that may well have to be made if we're going to see legislation go forward. The other thing that remains as a primary point of contention is the size of the enhanced unemployment payments. The Democrats came out at continuing $600 per week for the rest of the year. The original administration Senate Republican package was $200 a week, or a sufficient federal contribution to increase the combined state and federal payment to 70% of the prior wage. And again, the states, both Democratic and Republican, were very quick to point out that they probably could reprogram their computers to do that sometime in 2022, but don't expect us to be able to do anything now. That probably overstates things a little bit, but certainly that is, I think, a message that at least I've been given to understand they are beginning to hear. And that's one of the reasons that the presidential memo went to a direct amount, did not try and incorporate the 70% rule that had been included in the earlier negotiations. And that then brings us to our second polling question. And this one relates to the Republican proposal, not enacted legislation, sorry. But in this case, Amy, you want to read for us? But
Sure.
again, answer this in terms of the Republican proposal itself.
Okay, so polling question 2, true or false? Defendants could be held liable in COVID-19 related action only if they fail to make reasonable efforts to follow applicable public health guidelines and committed an act of gross negligence or intentional misconduct. All right, we will leave this open for about 20 more seconds to get everyone in. All right, I know we're running short on time, but we don't have many answers yet. So I'm going to leave this open. Go ahead and vote if you haven't done so yet. And Mel, you can just continue on.
Okay. We'll leave the poll. Now, can the poll stay up as we move to another slide?
Yep. Yep.
Oh, lovely. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and do that then. Now, so far, we've talked about the items of contention between the various sides. None of those were really tax provisions. The tax provisions, we don't have identical terms, but there is a lot of commonality in the tax provisions that have been included in the proposals from the Democratic and the Republican side. The one I would immediately draw your attention to, or first draw your attention to, is the employer retention credit that was added in the CARES Act. And you can see here some of the details on what is being done here. Originally, both the House Democratic bill and the Senate Republican bill propose significant increases both in the credit rate and in the amount of wages that qualify for the credit. Further, they have both proposed a loosening of the rules determining whether or not you're eligible for the credit, which is comparing quarter to quarter reduction in gross receipts, the one quarter in 2019 versus the same quarter in 2020. Originally, you had to show at least a 50%, or under present law, you have to show at least a 50% decline. The House would allow you to go down to 10%, although would phase that 80% down as you go from 50 to 10. The Senate, maybe having heard from somebody that, we've got enough calculations to worry with here, said, okay, just move it to 25. And if you have suffered a 25% reduction quarter to quarter in your gross receipts, you are now eligible. You would be eligible for the employee retention credit. The bulk of these are proposed to be retroactive as if included in the CARES Act. They've not been passed yet. They've not been enacted yet. But this may be a situation where if you're not talking about a tremendous number, you want to keep an eye on this. And certainly, if you are going to, if you qualify for the ERC, be in a position to go back and claim any additional that you missed, or perhaps recheck to see indeed you may be. There is a difference between small employers and large employers. Small employers can take the credit with respect to all wages paid. Larger employers can take the credit only with respect to wages that are paid to employees who are not working. Okay, what's a small employer? Well, under the CARES Act, you had to have less than 100 employees. Both the House and the Senate significantly increased these to less than 1,500 employees in the House, less than 500 employees in the Senate side. And other items, there has been a question as to whether group health plans, the group health plan expenses would qualify even if you weren't paying wages at that point in time. The IRS said, yeah, go ahead and qualify them. In wanting to take credit, both the House and the Senate said, yeah, we'll make that the law. So we're going to claim credit for that too. What happens if you are eligible for the ERC and you have a PPP loan forgiven? Well, under present law, if your PPP loan, if you took a PPP loan and it's forgiven, you do not get the ERC. The House did not change that rule, but essentially came in and provided another credit at 50% for certain wages that otherwise would have qualified for the ERC. The Senate, again, take a somewhat simpler approach. They just change the no to yes. So if the Senate provision were to hold, then it's a matter. Guesses as to where this comes out. I mean, these are, by and large, these are just numbers. And anytime we're just dealing with numbers, there is a compromise somewhere to be made. That compromise is probably going to be dependent on what the ultimate number for the size of the package is. The Senate is, each side would probably like to accept the most expensive proposal. So the Senate would be happy with the 80% credit amount, with the 1,500 employee rule. The House will be happy to allow you the ERC and PPP loan forgiveness and go to the 25% test for the quarter-to-quarter reduction. Again, can we fit all of that in underneath the, can we fit that all underneath the, whatever the ultimate cost is going to be? That's going to be the question, and that's going to be what determines. And I think that similarly is going to control, here, let's get back to this. I apologize. Is going to control what happens with some of the additional business credits that have been offered. The Senate has said, you know, why don't we just add people who were unemployed as a result of COVID-19 to the work opportunity tax credit? Okay. Very hard to believe that the Democratic House is opposed to this idea. The question is going to be, can we fit it under whatever the numerical cap is going to be on total revenue? Some form of credit for purchasing employee protection equipment. That is, the Senate has a 50% credit and makes it fully refundable. The House was only 30% and it was not fully refundable. Again, is it going to be refundable? What's the percentage going to be? It's the two sides have agreed on the idea. How much can be fit under whatever is determined to be the size of the package that we can deal with. An interesting one on the Senate side that I think was not thought of on the House side, and we're not quite sure where the House is going to come out on this, is a credit for investing in the manufacture of PPE equipment. Some of you may remember going back to one of the energy bills in the past, there was a credit for making the equipment to manufacture windmills, solar panels, other forms of alternative energy. And there was a pool of money devoted to it. You had to apply to get money out of the pool. Essentially the Senate has taken that idea, provided a $7.5 billion pool, and said, why don't we try that again? Not sure how this one is likely to fly because of the limitation. There are some questions as to whether or not it would be considered before the other credits that we talked about. But that again is, I think, something that you do want to keep your eye on, and something that is reasonably there. Paycheck Protection Program loans. The Senate has proposed a second round of PPP loans for really small businesses with a somewhat broader category of costs that would qualify. The Democrats did not include an equivalent provision in their bill, but have many of them, including members of leadership in the House Ways and Means Committee, has expressed support for a second round of paycheck protection loans. Again, the question here is going to be, well, I guess first, do we get additional legislation? And if we get additional legislation, how much is the government going to spend as part of that legislation? And how much of this type of program, additional of this type of program, can we fit in there? Now, just briefly, there are several provisions in both the HEROES and the HEALS Act that I think are not so likely to be moving forward. The House Democrats proposed eliminating the state and local tax deduction cap. That one's not moving forward. They proposed rolling back some of the CARES relief from the TCJA revenue raisers, things like net operating losses, business interest deductions, active business loss limitations, not expected to be included in any final package. Similarly, on the Senate side, a proposal for the full deductibility of business meals was added. Again, some questions there as to who really would be able to take advantage of increasing that deduction from 50 to 100%. So a thinking that is one that is much less likely to be included in a final version. And also the surprise inclusion of the mobile workforce legislation in the Senate bill, which would limit the ability of states to tax out-of-state non-residents who are working within the state for a limited period of time. This has been a huge debate in Congress for a number of years now, it is very, very difficult to see that even if this COVID-19 becomes must-pass legislation, it is likely to survive. I will also mention that several business groups, including the National Association of Manufacturers, had been strongly pushing for a provision that would allow for expanded refundability of general business credits, at least for a short period of time while we work our way out of the COVID-19 situation. That was not included in either the House or the Senate bills or proposals. And at this point, it looks like that is something that may be tabled for consideration in future years, but is unlikely to be included in this piece of legislation. If that is something that is of interest to you, is of concern to you, I know the folks at National Association of Manufacturers would love to hear from you and would love to get your company's name on the submissions. And with that, Let's move to polling question number 3. Amy?
All right, polling question number 3 is now open, and it is another true or false. Previous recipients of the PPP loans may apply for second round loans, but may not increase their total amount of PPP loans above $10 million.
And here again, we're talking about the Senate proposal, not legislation that has passed or been enacted.
All right. Make sure you answer this poll if you'd like CPE credit. Mel, I think we'll just leave it open while you continue on.
That sounds good. That sounds good. So let's move along here then and talk about, well, okay, what happens after the election? I think the answer to that is, well, first tell me who's going to win. Because how that plays out is really what is going to determine where we are likely to be. Now, this is a little difficult to see here with the question still up. This election appears to be primarily a referendum on President Trump. Here is a tracking of the approval and disapproval, approval in blue, disapproval in red, ratings that the president has had this year. And they arrive at this number by averaging about 7 different polls. There are a couple that are typically Democratic leading. There are a couple that are Republican leading. So there is a reasonable amount. I mean, there is a margin of error, but at the same time, there is a little better control here than just looking at one single poll. And it is, there's no question that there are issues with regard to the national approval rating. And if you look at some of the results of some of the other polls, I know NBC did a poll recently where they asked, why are you voting? And they asked people who said they would vote for Biden. They asked him why. Are you voting for Biden or are you voting against Trump? And 62% said, we're voting against Trump. And they asked Trump voters, well, are you voting for Trump or are you voting against Biden? Only 19% said they were voting against Biden. So Biden, it does not appear to be primarily the issue here. The issue is Trump. It is a referendum, and how that plays out is going to determine where this election goes. Now, what possibilities do we see? Oh, here, let's talk a couple of scenarios. There are many scenarios that could come about. We'll talk about 2 that seem to be the more likely ones. Scenario number 1, Trump's reelected. The Democrats are likely to hold on to the House of Representatives. They've already got certainly a decent working majority, and early poll indications are that that is more likely to increase than it is to decrease. What happens in the Senate is more of an open question, but there are good reasons to think that the Senate is likely to remain Republican, particularly if Trump is reelected. However, that is likely to be a very closely divided Senate. Certainly no greater majority than the 53 to 47 majority that the Republicans currently hold, and likely trending more toward 52-48 or 51-49. If that scenario comes about, what should we be looking for? We probably are going to be talking in the coming years about some additional tax cuts, but this time likely to be much more limited than, for instance, what we saw in 2017 with the TCJA. They are, in fact, they may be more targeted than general in that context. We know that the White House is very interested in exploring additional ways to expand domestic activity, to provide incentives for onshoring of what either are currently offshore activities or activities that we feel might be likely to be taken offshore. And so it may well be that the tax cuts we see are less in the state of reducing rates and are more focused on the question of, at least in the short term, providing some specific incentives for expansion of business expansions. Now, I will say in the context of the additional tax cuts, a separate question is, what do you do about the fact that the individual tax cuts are scheduled to expire? The individual tax cuts from TCJA are scheduled to expire. There is certainly a likelihood that we will see an effort to either completely do away with that or at least push that date farther out if we are operating under scenario number one. If we are, the question is, does Congress do something before they have to? And as we saw with the individual alternative minimum tax, as we saw with the Bush tax cuts from 2001, Congress does not always deal with things before they absolutely have to. And so while I think we would see that on the table, and certainly it would have to be given some consideration, it may be that more short-term tax incentives are going to be focused. One thing that we do know will be very different under a Trump reelection versus a Biden reelection is how the United States responds to the OECD initiatives, the idea of providing more of a uniform global tax system. A Trump White House is not going to be interested in that. And in fact, may be willing to continue some of the trade activities that they have engaged in so far. Now, on the other hand, let's take a look at election scenario number two. Again, here we flip the presidential. Biden is elected. Let's leave the Democratic House pretty much where it is. And the question is going to be in the Senate. And there's good reason to think that even if Biden is elected, the Senate is going to remain in Republican hands, although, again, it is likely to be very closely divided. As we say right now, the Republicans have 53. From early polls, and early polls we learned in 2016, we have to be careful using the early polls to too great an extent, but there are very clear majorities for the Republicans to take back the Alabama seat that they do not have. Democrats are looking at potentially taking Republican seats in Maine, Colorado, and Arizona. Now, if all of those fall that way, and those are the ones that seem to be showing a clear potential for shift from one party to another, then we have Republicans with 51, and we have the Democrats with 49. So unless the Democrats could somehow shake loose a Republican to cross party lines, then the Republican Senate, and even if they could, a Senate that is that closely divided or is in minority party hands, in the hands of a party that is not in the White House, is going to prevent the adoption of radical changes, and particularly, I think, could be looked to prevent the adoption of the kind of radical changes that some people are afraid could occur in the tax regime. There are other reasons why scenario number two also may not lead to the kind of very significant tax changes that perhaps we would have looked at if Bernie Sanders, for instance, were to become president. For one thing, the initial focus is going to be on getting the economy going again as a result of COVID-19. That simply is going to stands in the way of any sort of complete elimination of TCJA. And I know that's likely to be in the platform that the Democrats are going to vote on this week, but that is just not really, I think, in the cards. For one thing, there were an awful lot of Democrats that may not have agreed with 21% as the proper corporate rate, but understood the need to reduce the corporate rate in order to provide a more competitive environment for U.S. multinationals, U.S. companies in general. Biden himself, I think, has not proposed a rate higher than 28% in any of his, and there are reports of comfort in the 25% range. So yes, you might see an increase in the corporate rate from 21 to 25. But the idea that we would go back to 35 and that we would, somehow go to 90% tax on individuals, that's just not going to be. That's not going to be part of this scenario in any case. The same kind of incentives for onshoring and expanding domestic activity that would likely be considered under the under a Trump presidency, or I think are likely to be on the table here again. And something like we mentioned the National Association of Manufacturers and their push to make general business credits refundable. I think we'll see other kinds of credits, somewhat along the lines of some of the ones that we see discussed in COVID-19, some of them perhaps more general. Now, the international side is going to come from a very, very different position. I think there is a feeling among the Democrats that the Republicans in 2017 did not completely close the barn door with regard to runaway income. And so I think you are going to see a reexamination of that on the part of the Democrats if we were to fall under something like this scenario. But we're not going to be seeing the same kind of trade barriers, I think, that we would under the president. Now, all that those are my thoughts. Those are not Ide Bailey's. They're the ones that I have been able to gather from talking with the people now by phone now, since we can't meet in person, who work on the Hill, who work in the White House, or who spend time with them. I hope that is informative. I hope that gives you some thoughts to take with you as you begin to plan, and definitely hope that you'll rejoin us again in September when we may have more, we may know more, we may have more specific tax provisions to talk about. And then again, we'll be planning a legislative session for after the election, where we will no longer have to say, well, is it scenario 1, scenario 2, scenario 3? We will be able to say. And so, Amy, let me give it to you for our last polling question. And I want to thank everyone for staying with us for the full hour, and look forward to your joining us again in the future.
Awesome. All right, so you should see that polling question on your screen. Will you be joining us on our next update? Go ahead and answer that before you log off. I know we do have some questions in here, but we are short on time. So I will pull this report and I will get it to Mel, and we will do our best to get everything answered. We'll email you and get that out soon. Give us a few days to get everything in order, okay?
Yes, I see the questions that have been submitted, and I will try and, if possible, get those to you shortly. As Amy mentioned, the email that each of you should have received about an hour, maybe 45 minutes prior to the start of this session includes a link to the slides that we used. Feel free to take those for whatever use that you have, with the exception of the cartoon that appears at the front. My license with that is for my use and not for your use. So if you want to reproduce that one, do it to share among friends, but I ask you not to include it in your presentations. So thank you, and again, look forward to talking with everyone at the next session.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for attending, and thank you, Mel, and we hope you have a great day.